It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up.
All right. So we did this really responsible thing where we only met about an hour or two ago, but we ended up chatting so much. I don't know if we even actually ended up chatting about the panel, but there's plenty to talk about on this topic. So just quick introduction. My name is Sylvester-Chaudhuri. I'm a founder of a nonprofit called CivLab. We're based in New York City, Detroit, and LA, and London as well. And we fund and work with climate organizations in education, workforce development, and technology. I'm privileged to be back here at this conference. I want to thank Dale and Shalina and the rest of the organizers. But let's get to the nitty-gritty and the important piece, which is not me, the moderator. I'm just the facilitator, but the experts themselves. And just I don't want to sit too long on this kind of on what the circular economy is, but I think there's something really interesting to know, which is this is the first year at COP that they actually talked about the circular economy, which I think is a little bit late, but progressive in itself. And so, you know, by I think 2050 is the year we're going to have more plastic in the water than there are fish. And I love oysters, so we have to do something about this, folks. And I think the organizers, I have to also say, they did a great job of bringing together a panel from different perspectives. And so first, I want to start with the global perspective, and Nicole's from the UN. Nicole, can you tell us a little bit about, what you do at the UN? And I think you probably have the most unconventional title of anybody at this conference, but why this is relevant to your work.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and hello, everybody. Indeed, I think I'm probably the most unusual panelist here in this conference. I work for the United Nations Organization on Drugs and Crime, and we have quite a large portfolio that deals with what we call crimes that affect the environment. And that means, for example, wildlife trafficking, illegal deforestation, but also illegal extraction of critical raw materials. And that's probably an area which is easier relatable to what we are talking about. We also look at the vulnerabilities along the supply chains and how we can address this. How can we help states to have better transparency, better accountability, better legislation to ensure that these processes, that circular economy is working well. As I said, we work mainly with governments. These are our main clients, but I'm mainly here also to see how we can better work with the private sector, because what we need is really a multifaceted approach. Everybody has to play a role to ensure that there's enough transparency and accountability. And I think I stop here for now, otherwise I continue. Thank you.
And no worries, when she started speaking, we started tracking all the people that left the room. So Marcin, you sit in a lot of different types of boardrooms, whether they be government or private sector. How have you seen, and if you could talk a little bit about your role in working with those types of organizations, that would be great globally, but how have you seen the attitude and thinking change in the last 5 to 10 years, or even the last 2 to 5 years?
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. And by the way, good afternoon, everyone, on this fine afternoon. I'm Marcin from Boston Consulting Group, so I'm a consultant, and I'm actually one of the global experts in the area of energy and petrochemicals. Not very green industry still recently, but as you rightly said, there are some signals of what we may say a resilient and sustainable change. Yes, and among many of those signals, what make me think positive about what we talk sustainable economies, sustainable supply chains, is that first of all, we have very, very strong commitments of brand owners. When we had the first wave of sustainability discussions, and that was like you said, 10, maybe 15 years ago, there was not such a strong commitment from all the major brand owners in things like beverages, textiles, sport apparel, automotive, etc. today, this is different and very visible. Secondly, I think the financial community. There is a profound change. The financial community is approaching now investment opportunities. And more, if you have something dirty in your portfolio, like, you generate a lot of emissions, you don't seem to work to care about the environment, your ESG standing is not the best, you may just not get the money. And I think, lastly, and that was very visible in Dubai last year during COP, the emerging part of the planet is significantly more engaged in a sustainable effort. It's not like Europe is crazy about sustainability and why should we care? No. It's now a little bit the opposite. You see a lot of momentum in countries which are either growing quickly, but they do have, because of this fast growth, they do have some sustainability challenges, or countries that were the global powerhouses when it comes to the supply of gas, oil, petrochemicals, you name it. Yes, I personally worked a lot in the Middle East with the private petrochemical sector, and I can tell you, I think I did more decarbonization projects there than I did elsewhere. They take it quite seriously, and that is not something that was happening 10 years ago. So these signals make me positive about the effort we are talking about.
And you just said Christoph's favorite word, which is decarbonization.
Yes.
And Christoph, you come from a space where, I mean, there probably could be no more product in the world that is more relevant to the circular economy than the car. Not just because of the vehicle itself, but all the different pieces. So how at Audi and in your work have you guys been integrating circular economy thinking into the whole life cycle of a car?
Well, first, so to say, we started back in 2018, and hello again from my side to the audience, before I forget it. We started back in 2018 with a decarbonization program, right, where we rolled out, where we had this development that you just described, Marcin, and what we saw is that for decarbonization, also circular economy plays a significant role, right? So it's about sustainability, it's about financial resources as well, as we tend to rely, of course, to specific resources that we might bundle up in this case. And we set ourselves strong goals to reach. So we aim to be carbon neutral by 2050. We aim to reduce our carbon emissions by 40% over the whole corporate actions that we have on balance, by 40% in 2030. And that's a huge challenge that we face right now. And due to the electrification that we see within our fleets and the efforts that we have within the energy industry, that we can use green charging for our cars, this enables us to focus even right now on the right levers that we need to pull, which lie obviously in the supply chain, right? So in the supply chain, we need different approaches, hotspot approaches, as we cannot wait to have this kind of silver bullet technology that saves us all. We need to act now. So we have this temporal component that we cannot delete in the equation. And so for me, yeah, it's like I said, you have to break an egg to make an omelette. So this is how we started decarbonization, and we're still going, and it's going pretty well, to be honest.
That's great. And I think you bring up a really important point that it's not just the big solutions, it's like identifying small things that we can solve and change, which I think takes us to our final distinguished panelists in Toussaint. How did you, and I'd love for you to walk the audience through the problem you're solving, but how did you hone in on that being the thing that's going to help you play your part in saving the planet?
Yeah, totally. Great to meet you all and spend some time to talk a bit about Upway. So for those who don't know, who are not as familiar about Upway as you are about AUDI, BCG, or the United Nations.
You will be soon.
I'll cover maybe what we do. So in short, we're a platform that sells refurbished e-bikes. And so what that means is that we buy used e-bikes from consumers, companies, whatever their condition. We refurbish them in our workshops. So we have one in Berlin, another in Belgium, in France, now in the US as well. And then we sell them online to consumers, which means that you're able to get tons of choice, tons of brands at a great price, but with the peace of mind of a high quality product that comes with a warranty, which was really needed in order to build this circular economy for e-bikes. What got us to hone in on that problem was we saw that the e-bike adoption was moving super fast with plenty of upsides. It's a product that is fun and convenient for consumers, but it's also great for people's health, great for lowering carbon emissions, for saving public space. But the problem was that a lot of people wanted to acquire an e-bike, thought new products were quite expensive, wanted to go second-hand, but didn't trust buying second-hand, largely because it's a technical product. So if the engine breaks on you after 3 months, you want to have someone to turn to, and because it's still an expensive product. And so you want to make sure that you're confident about the quality of what you're buying. And so that's why we decided to build Upway, to really build trust in the second-hand market, and that way extend the life cycle of every product that makes it to Europe, and make sure that multiple owners can benefit from it. One thing that was fascinating as we digged into the category is that about 70% of the carbon footprint of an e-bike over its life cycle comes from the manufacturing stage and its transport to its end destination. So typically many parts coming from Asia all the way to Europe. And so by extending the lifetime of a product, making sure that with a few fixes, a few spare parts replacements, we're able to get it a second life, a third life. We're truly helping amortize this carbon footprint over multiple owners, more miles, and ultimately reduce this entire carbon footprint.
That's great. And I forgot to play a game that I usually like to play when I moderate with the audience, just so we know who we're talking to, and we can be as helpful as possible. Who here is from a startup? Raise your hand. Okay, a couple. Private sector? Public sector? Nonprofits? VCs, finance? Unemployed looking for a job? If any of you guys are hiring, right up here. So, just staying with you for a second. With something like circular economy, we talked about this backstage, it being such a systemic change with so many people, pieces, parts, all of you in the audience, you one day. What is the role of other stakeholders in making your startup successful? Whether that be in the business model itself or just as a startup?
Yeah, I think to your point, there's a lot of stakeholders involved. I think it's starting with what got us started and what enabled us to move this quickly to so many countries. Upway is a 2.5-year-old company, but we were able to expand so quickly because we raised $60 million over the course of 2.5 years. And so having that investor community see the potential of the circular economy, see the economic outcome that it can lead to, is probably the first big thing. And I think there's a big movement happening. One of our very first investors was Sequoia, so there's definitely a big awareness of the opportunity within the circular economy, but clearly it's not yet something that is seen as a major future ecosystem by everyone. And so that's the first stakeholder that needs to keep getting convinced. I think then we need the entire life cycle and the entire ecosystem of your category, so in our case e-bikes, to be on board. So we already work with more than 1,500 retailers, bike shops, and we enable them to buy back someone's old bike when they sell them a new one. So we empower them to offer a trade-in solution. But it's really important that, from retailers to manufacturers to insurance players, that everyone integrates into their model that a product can have multiple lifetimes and can have multiple owners. And more now, we're working with manufacturers in the e-bike category to make sure that they take that into account and that they even work with us to encourage this renewal and make sure the product don't go to garbage at the end of the day. And lastly, I think within that manufacturing stage, we really need to make sure that the lifetime is as long as possible and that even spare parts availability is as reliable as possible to ensure that those products don't have a shorter lifetime than they could have.
And Christoph, how do you think about it from the Audi perspective, looking at all these different parts, looking at cars in terms of the whole product life cycle, integrating all these different stakeholders that are involved?
I mean, I could talk about this for an hour right now, at least.
Well, you got 20 minutes, but
yeah, I try to keep it short. No, but I think that's the right assessment that you have here right now. We're trying the same. I could compare it. We're building up something with our genuine parts right now that we can use our used genuine parts as well. Because currently, you can go to a retailer, you can buy genuine parts in pieces, right? And you could then use them. Let's say the side mirror. Or, and this is what we're trying to set up right now, we have different categories from used mirrors and the shell, of course. Let's say it's A, B, C, and of course this is also a good opportunity not only for sustainability, but for our customers if they're more cost sensitive. Yeah. So we're investigating in a lot of different dimensions in this case. And when it comes to decarbonization, yeah, of course we know that secondary material has a better footprint, but this is not an assessment that I could say is per se the case, right? So I'm oftenly asked, Chris, is this sustainable? And the question that I tend to give is, it depends. Because there is no such answer to this question, right? So you could, of course, produce anything from secondary material, but with all those processes that would need it in the meantime to bring the used part or the used material back to its original state where you could use it in a new part, especially when we talk about crash-relevant parts, and I think everyone cares about safety in our cars today. So it's very, very difficult to bring this all together.
Marcin, I'm going to come to you. Don't worry, I haven't forgot. But I want to take everyone on this roller coaster ride that I went on backstage, talking with you and then talking with Nicole. So Nicole, when you hear all this, thinking about supply chain, like when we're talking about things like risk and transparency, what does that mean to you in your role? And what are some of the things all around the world that you're seeing?
Right. Just to tell you that your initiative is a wonderful example that helps directly or indirectly addressing illegal activities. To give you an example, I don't know, many of you might have seen documentaries about these huge mountains of electrical waste in Africa. A lot of batteries, e-waste, is illegally dumped in countries where we don't have very good enforcement, where we don't have very good regulations. So rather than having a proper recycling, it's just being dumped. And so your initiative, as I said, helps to prevent this. On the other hand, if there's a huge demand for critical raw materials, everybody wants to drive now a battery car, right? But the raw materials have to come from somewhere. The demand increases, the products, the commodities become more scarce. All these things provide an opportunity for criminal groups to get engaged. So whenever you have conditions where there is very weak legislations, regulations, very weak possibility of ending up in prison, basically, because nobody cares, organized criminals will become engaged in it. So illegal mining is a huge growing business for organized criminals, and it's a big problem. And it's not that criminal groups get engaged, but we have human rights violations, we have labor violations, human trafficking, corruption, money laundering. Now, I don't want to paint a really dark picture here, but my intention is to really bring these aspects into the whole topic of or discussions of climate change. That if you don't ensure that there's transparency, there's a lot of opportunity then for criminals to enrich themselves through circular economy, through carbon credit markets. So there's a lot of areas or opportunities for fraud there. And we are trying to partner with the private sector, with governments, to ensure that the conditions are right, and circular economy is something that then can really grow and be efficient and effective.
So no, and I think it's just really important to paint the picture of how big of a space this is or issue this is in terms of waste and regeneration. Marcin, can you talk a little bit, something I love that you were speaking about earlier is just kind of like practical innovations that help solve the problem. Can you speak, whether it's alternative fuels or storage, can you speak a little bit about like easy things that large corporations or governments can do that will really help solve the problem?
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, what we have just been discussing to a great extent, we are talking about orchestrating ecosystems or harmonizing ecosystems.
100%.
Sustainable ecosystems, net zero ecosystems, but we have to harmonize them. The difference between this and what we used to have is that there are far more many variables than before, and it is actually quite complex. And if we talk about those net zero ecosystems, I think two things, apart from exposure to new type of risks that we have just covered, but two things are basically are very visible. One is, as you said, we need to have some form of storage for energy, or we talk a lot about hydrogen. This hydrogen needs to be stored somewhere to make those ecosystems happen. And this is a new type of storage that we didn't have before. And the second thing is that matching supply and demand needs to be taken to a much more elevated way and smarter way than before. Starting with very simple things. I want to have my e-scooter or e-bike be available at 7 a.m. in the morning outside my home because I'm gonna take my kid to the kindergarten and I don't want to be late. How to make it happen, yes? And we can continue. My example that I like a lot is about balancing energy distribution networks, yes? And as we know very well, and we know especially here in Germany, when you have a lot of renewable sources of energy in the network is not so easy to manage, yes? You have moments when there is too much energy in the network. There may be something called, we discussed while preparing Dunkelflaute, yes? So this is my contribution to the German language, when there is not enough renewable sources available. And what's there? And here we may talk about demand response, but we would like to engage individuals in this demand response. And by the way, solutions could be available because information is there. I have an application from one of the energy companies in my iPhone which says, okay, now you should use more energy, but in the evening you should use less because the network is very busy. But does it incentivize me? Not at all, yes? If my Garmin watch tells me, you have to do 5,000 steps this evening because otherwise you will not meet your quota for the week, I'm taking my AirPods and I'm walking around my home to make the steps listening to a podcast. And you told me that I could use a dog, and that's I need to think about. But going back to those smart solutions, these are examples where we need every technology innovation to make those things happen and work them better, yes? And I said two things which are new and we need to focus on: storage of energy and some of those energy media, and matching supply and demand in a smart way.
So I think you brought us to an important part of the discussion, which is electrification. Christoph, something you mentioned before as well. So how is Audi thinking about electrification and how that's going to change our future?
I mean, it's pretty obvious that we are aiming for a 100% electrified portfolio in the future, right? So we've talked about this a lot, and we think that it's the right strategy to go, because we saw a lot of backlash in the recent weeks in terms of this, especially in Germany, as we see that the sales of EV cars are not as tremendous as they are in France or in Great Britain, right? So, but for us, electrification brings a lot of positive points into the discussion, right? So it's first, we are able to produce cars that have a great acceleration, and if you have not tried yet, please do so. I can just recommend it, even when it's the fast cars, or an RS e-tron GT or something like that. And they do not make any sound. Of course, the artificial one that needs to be there out of safety reasons. And of course, they do not harm the environment in terms of smoke or something that's from the exhaust pipe, right? So this is another health aspect. Another one is battery electric cars may also work with bidirectional engagement, right? So you could use your electric car at home as a home storage. So while you do not have the Dunkelflaute, you could save the energy or charge the battery and then use the energy that is saved or in the battery and use it for your home. Use it, at least you can buy green energy when it's cheaper on the market, right? If you set up some artificial intelligence on that one. So I think we're all on one spot when you say we can combine that in the future. Electrification will lead us to great benefits.
And you can play with all that from your iPhone to make it cool.
Exactly, everything is interconnected.
And I feel like in circular economy, we also have like direct systems and indirect systems that kind of affect your business. So I feel like electrification might be an indirect system that really affects your business with things like charging infrastructure. So in New York, for example, a massive issue is everyone wants EVs, but we don't have any chargers. And it's something that the city is like frantically trying to figure out. So how is electrification changing or supporting your business, and how do you kind of have to deal with those systems outside of your day-to-day business?
Yeah, I think like first of all, we talk a lot about electrification of cars, but e-bikes ultimately are an electric engine-powered vehicle. They just happen to be a lot lighter and a lot, like let's say smaller. But it's definitely part of that movement, which is how do we bring the convenience, how do we bring even the fun, as you were describing, of moving around, and how do we make that as low emission as possible, and as positive for cities, the environment, people's health as possible. So I think that electrification movement is definitely what is also supporting or the reason behind the explosion of adoption of e-bikes over the last 5 to 10 years, depending on the countries. And then when it comes to what the indirect aspects are that play a role behind that, I think there's a few things that come to mind. The first is we've seen a very big difference between Europe and the US when it comes to safety hazards. In Europe, there's been long-standing safety standards that were imposed upon manufacturers that required batteries and motors to reach certain levels. What that meant was that bikes were a little more expensive than in the US, but on the other hand, they were incredibly safe. And so we saw incredibly few fire hazards incidents in Europe, whereas in the US, for a long time, there were no such safety standards on, for example, battery quality, motor quality. And what that led to is a number of pretty terrible events of fires catching up while the e-bike was charging in buildings that sometimes put the building on fire. So clearly there was a lot of concern there, which actually can be, in a way, easily addressed through the right regulation. And a second aspect is that it's one thing to have adoption of certain vehicles, certain mobility means, but it also requires infrastructure change. For the case of electric cars, I'm sure like charging infrastructure is top of mind because it clearly drives adoption. In the case of e-bikes, it's actually the cycling infrastructure that is absolutely required to make people feel safe riding an e-bike. One of the number one obstacles to people choosing to buy and then ride an electric bike today is the feeling of lack of safety, especially in big cities, when the infrastructure is not right. So a city like Paris has made tremendous progress over the last 5 years and has installed hundreds of kilometers of cycling lanes that has increased adoption very, very fast to record levels, whereas other cities are much slower at that. And so you can see that there is more to it than just how good the product is. There is also how much external, in particular public support there is in building that infrastructure.
So with the remaining time, I want to get a little bit more personal. One thing I love about working in climate is like all of this. Like we're in it together. I think in a different way than a lot of other spaces are. I think entrepreneurialism can be lonely at times, but today it's not. And because these systems are so complex, because they take so many stakeholders, including everyone in the audience, what is there? For kind of a last closing remark from each of you, but we'll start with you. Like, is there something you can tell the audience on a way to get engaged or involved or even support your mission that will be helpful for you to be successful?
Yeah, maybe I have two thoughts. The first is at a very, very concrete level for Upway and more generally for the kind of business model that we operate it's, I think, super important to help build trust in the circular economy and in particular in reusing products. I think one of the number one barriers we face and one of the key priorities that we have is to build that trust. The reason we exist is because there was a lack of trust in buying a used product. And I think it's, there's still a journey to go through for people to feel like buying secondhand can be, under the right circumstances, as good as new in a way. And at least, if you're cost conscious and you're willing to have a slightly less modern and recent set of specs that you're able to get really, really high quality products. So that the first piece is, if you don't have that trust today, keep informing yourself and build up that trust and help convey that kind of word out there. And the second is, and I think that's already the case for, I'm sure, plenty of people in this room, but the advice I give in particular when talking to potential candidates joining the company is it's super important to work for a mission that you care about. And I think today there's very little convincing to do about the importance of getting to net zero industries, getting to more circular economies. And so everything we can do to convince more people to put their energy and their efforts behind such a mission is critical. And so, the more you can encourage your friends, family, and the surroundings in joining this kind of mission, I think the faster we will be at having that kind of impact.
Absolutely. And Christoph, you come from an organization with such an iconic brand, and I think that with that comes responsibility too, at least in the future that I see. And I was very impressed with your decarbonization study happening 5 years ago. So how do you leverage that as an individual in such a big organization to accomplish the goals that we're all kind of clearly here for?
It's exactly the opposite, right? So, of course, you have to fight, as sustainability is not for free to implement it in our products, even when it's in the premium market, right? And of course, there are a lot of discussions as our customers see sustainability as part of the price that they're already paying. So we try to bring the sustainability to our cars due to the core of our processes. And of course, it's not always easy, to be honest, because you fight a lot, of course, when it's a little bit more expensive to bring that carbon optimized aluminum into the car or to that part and stuff like that. But I think it's worth it. And I do think that our management has understood, not only at Audi, but also at Volkswagen, at the whole group,
right,
that sustainability is key for the future, as well as electric mobility is a fast lever to reach sustainable mobility. So this is one point that I forgot to mention because it was the most obvious one to me. Electric mobility is sustainable when used with green charging. And so for me is the main point that I want to mention today is the collaboration. I talked about this temporal aspect, so we do not have the time to relax and see what silver bullet technology comes over. We need to act right now. And for me, then collaboration is key, as we do not want to fall into this black hole of, let's say, specific bolts and nuts analyses. We can do that, of course, but when we talk about supply chains, it's tier 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can imagine as a car manufacturer with 5,000 different parts in a car. This is quite a challenge. And so, yes, it's important for us to have the collaboration, to have some premises, some generica that you can work with, but it's difficult to find the balance where you can go with the chain of custody, which is good, so you have the certificates, you don't have to know every supplier in there, but also you need to know that you have decarbonized material, you have secondary material, you have circular material, because there are some regulations, it's good that they are, and they need to be refined and overworked as well so that they fit. And then we have only talked about the automotive industry. How does this big picture, so the automotive industry is just one puzzle piece, how does this fit together all in all? So this will be our challenges in the future, and I'm glad to tackle them.
Amazing. How many parts are there in an e-bike?
Yeah, definitely under 1,000.
Okay, not 5,000.
Not as complex as a car, for sure.
All right, Marcin, you're our international businessman. You're in all these boardrooms. Give us some hope for optimism from the top.
The hope is there. The hope is there. But I think as we continue the journey on this ecosystem orchestration or harmonization, we'll definitely face dilemmas. Yeah? And that can be at a macro scale. And here a very simple example. Imagine you are a European fertilizer producer such as Yara or Gruppa Azoty. And you start to sort of think, okay, should I produce ammonia locally, but it's expensive, gas is expensive, energy is expensive. Should I bring blue ammonia from the US? Yeah, it's decarbonized there, it's good, etc. But then someone can say, okay, but how about food safety in Europe? Yes, and you may also have that at a smaller scale. You are a venture into chemical recycling with the pyrolysis technology, your reactor starts to work, you are very enthusiastic, you want to scale it up, but you don't have enough waste to process. And you say, okay, I'm going to bring some waste, I'm going to import some waste, but do we want to stimulate waste importing? It can have some backfire effects. So I think we will face a lot of dilemmas. Where I'm very positive about is that as I see some of those ecosystems develop, it's actually very different than how the business developed like 20, 30 years ago. You see a lot of that collaboration. Collaboration among peers, collaboration among value chain, let's say, participants such as producers, ports, shipping lines, you name it. And also the element of trust. I think it's at a different level. Yes, people are more open, they are willing to discuss because we are going a little bit into the unknown and we have to be ready. But I think also there is a lot about how the policy making should be done in the future, because this collaboration, this level of trust and this kind of a proactiveness with an open mind, I think that also applies to the policy makers, yes? And I believe that will have to be done differently than in the past.
Well, that's a good segue. So, Nicole, I love having you on this panel because it's different than most people we have on these panels, and so I encourage that diversity in the future for the organizers. But I asked you earlier, I said there must be so many things that keep you up at night. I can't even imagine, but can we talk about what gets you up in the morning and why, and maybe if there is any call to action or why there is hope and optimism?
I'm an optimist
Okay,
person,
good.
and when I see initiatives like you, then I really do believe that we can achieve something. And really, I'm here to emphasize or to make people not to forget about illegalities and crimes that affect the environment have a direct impact or are a direct driver to climate change, to loss of biodiversity and pollution. So it's very, very important in all of these discussions that we have that we don't forget that. And I also want to emphasize that private sector have a role to play in the sense that they need to do their due diligence. They need to know where the raw materials are coming from, and so they can can contribute a lot to prevent and address these illegalities. And private sector, I mean, I see a lot of great startup companies here. They can work with local communities, which would help them not to engage in illegal activities. You can imagine in countries in the Amazonas region or in Africa, people live in local communities. They have nothing else than to engage in illegal logging and wildlife trafficking. You know, think about maybe working with local communities, offering them a solution, offering them other economic opportunities. Policies, I fully agree. Regulation, policy is very important. Legislation is important. But it's also important to enforce it, and it's important to also create the social and economic conditions surrounding it. Yep. Because otherwise, if we manage to solve one problem, we still have another problem. So it's all a cycle.
Communities aren't just customers.
Exactly.
Do we have time for a question or two? Sure. Does anyone have a question? Well, then, with that, maybe the clock pause. With that, will everyone join me with a round of applause for this great panel?
It's time to wake up.